honored to be here. I want to thank all the organizers and the people who are part of the not only the conference but also the HMO that I am finding out more and more about, and finding out that what we do with my Accademia Adrianea, which is the graduate version of the Pantheon Institute, is very similar to what you all are concerned with and what you teach and what you engage in terms of the issues related to our sort of cultural heritage, how it ought to be managed, how it ought to be preserved, conserved, and brought forward. I have a particular take on what we do that has much more to do with the physical aspects of cultural heritage, and what we teach in our master's program is they're basically design workshops that are intended to give architects and designers and archaeologists an experience, a kind of exercise on what is effective as a way to change some of the monuments and ruins that we engage in, to change them through a process that makes them more contemporary and sort of reconciles the past, which is usually what's represented in some of these monuments, to the current situation that they engage on a sort of urban level. Today, what I want to present to you is a little bit about the work of the Accademia Adrianea, which is this master's granting institution that I have the pleasure of helping to run with another partner who's not here today, obviously, and who has been very, very effective in generating some of the sites that we've worked on. It's a very unique master's program, even for architectural contexts, because we travel mostly through the Mediterranean, but also now as far away as Tehran. We've even done workshops in China, and most recently we've been, I think now 4 years in New York City as well. So we tend to look at the question of ruins, the question of monuments in a slightly more global kind of context to understand how architecture, the design of the spaces for archaeological concerns are actually part of a cultural setting that is much broader, much more comprehensive, and multifaceted. In fact, we're kind of exploring this latent capacity of architecture and architectural design to reconcile the different levels of reality. And I applaud Vasily's talk on the ontological questions, because those are the essential, I would say almost primal issues related to why people not only preserve monuments and are moved by ruins, but why they build in the first place. Why do people construct architecture, and let's say architectures that are long-lasting, usually much longer lasting than any specific function that generated a program, or usually much longer lasting than the client who is actually engaged in offering the project to begin with. I would also like to say something about the use of archaeology as a way to kind of to understand culture. Archaeology is not just a kind of preservation for the sake of remembrance. I think that there is a connection to the experience of archaeology and the experience of architecture that is much deeper and richer than just a reference to historical times or to something that happened in the past. And you know, one of our premises in doing the work that we do, both academically but also professionally, is that we understand that the necessity of archaeology, that is the science of archaeology, the study of archaeology, and the existence of it, why it has come about, is proof that architecture is significant to culture as a whole. It's proof that no matter how bad or how unrepresentative of a culture a piece of urban artifact is, when it becomes archaeological, it demands interpretation. And in that demanding of interpretation, then it becomes meaningful. But not only does it become meaningful as an artifact that is a ruin, as an artifact that is part of an archaeological dig or an archaeological inquiry, but it also is significant culturally for the architecture that it represents. That is, the reading of the ruin is that of the previous architecture that made it, essentially. And what's fascinating about all of this, and one of the reasons why we do the things in the manner in which we do them, is that the experience of the ruin ought to be poetic in nature. It ought to be not literal and prosaic, not easy to explain or define, but should exist in the world of poetics, in the same way that an architectural, full-blown, multi-dimensional architectural experience is poetic, essentially. What I'm going to show you are some slides of a competition that just last year our master's program thought up and sponsored, essentially. Once we got started and we got some interest on this competition, the municipality of Rome came on board and participated as a sponsor. The Ministry of Cultural Affairs in Italy, the national ministry, got involved and helped sponsor our activity. And in the end, by this time last year, we had 20 projects that were submitted by, I'll show you how the design teams were selected and put together, where the jury was composed of representatives of the National Ministry of Culture, a couple of, at least 3 different committees in the municipality of Rome that governs archaeological sites and historical preservation activity, and the Urban Planning Authority of the City of Rome as well. All of these participated in the jury selection of the winners. Out of the 20 projects submitted, only 19 of which were completed. 3 were selected as equally meritorious. The 3 projects that I'm going to show you at the end of my presentation will represent 3 completely different ways of engaging a rather significant piece of Rome's archaeological heritage. It is the Via dei Fori Imperiali, and I'll show you the context within which we operated the competition and the physical space that was part of the competition in a few minutes. But it is an important image for the city of Rome that we have engaged, and it is probably the most significant part of the, let's say, transnational understanding of the city of Rome, where from other capitals, the image of Rome and what it looks like, what it feels like, is transmitted by this particular site. It's the area between the Colosseum and the Victor Emmanuel Monument, for those of you who know, but as I say, I'll show you that in a minute. Before I do that, let me tell you a little bit about the Premio Piranesi. We organize every year a workshop that is centered on the work that is being done and has been done over the years at Hadrian's Villa just outside of Rome. Hadrian's Villa is a very large expanse of archaeology, mostly the remains of the villa that was built by Hadrian himself in the 2nd century AD. And it's probably one of the largest single project archaeological sites in the world. And it has had its ups and downs in terms of conservation and maintenance. It is now being, let's say, reconsidered as also a site for cultural activity. And part of what we have done over the years is to engage the Sovrintendenza, the organizing institution that governs it, in suggesting ways in which an archaeological site can in fact be re-presented to the culture that is immediately around it. With that thought, we decided to engage the very center of Rome on the manner of what was done in the 17th and 18th centuries with the Prix de Rome. And that's one of the reasons why we have sort of collocated our title for the Prix de Rome in that setting of the sort of 17th, 18th century pensionnaires who would come to Rome to measure and to essentially represent through a kind of architectural analysis of the monuments, of the ruins, what was available. And some of these drawings that come from this period, from the French school, are absolutely beautiful, incredibly detailed, and with a scientific understanding, not science in the empirical science way, but science in the scienza come conoscenza, as an understanding kind of way. The materiality of these drawings is quite spectacular. And the reconstruction. These are make-believe architectures that very few of these pensionnaires had any archaeological data other than the ruins themselves that would explain exactly what the architecture might have been. But that didn't stop them from drawing what their interpretation of the ruins could have been in the physicality of architecture that was concluded. These are drawings from the Palatine, and they're quite lovely, but completely bogus. We have no idea if the buildings on the Palatine looked anything like this, but they are based on archaeological finds that were there and were very specific in terms of measured plan drawings, especially of the, these are the pensionnaires who did this work not as a way to, let's say, represent or reconstruct any kind of historical presence, but as a way to interpret and give meaning, cultural meaning, to those ruins. And it was on this model that we're basically doing something similar with our students here at Largo Argentina, where 2 years ago this was. We did a project for there's a new subway station that was hypothesized directly under these ruins, and we had our students work on the design of the subway station as part of an archaeological museum that was part of the movement system through. There are similar sites, I think, in Athens that have done very, very similar projects. These are our students at the Pecile Wall at Hadrian's Villa. And did something happen? Yeah, and this is during the Premio Piranesi, working on Hadrian's Villa opportunities to sort of provide access where access is not. This is how they present. At the end of the 2-week design charrette, students are asked to make presentations to a committee, a jury committee. Prizes are awarded, master's program scholarships are awarded as part of the prizes, and all of this takes place in Rome. And when it's all done, we have a nice party and everybody's happy. What happened last year was a little different. Well, can I go forward? Am I not going forward? Here we go. Last year we decided to do the Premio Piranesi in 2 phases. One designed for students, and that's the one on the left. And the other, Designing Archaeology 2016, was designed specifically for professionals, but a very unique cadre of professionals. We wanted professional architects and designers who had experience with archaeological sites and teamed with academics. We wanted academic teachers of architecture, people who have written or done research at an academic institution on this question of archaeology and the integration of archaeological sites to the current conditions of their situation, and teaming those up to provide a much more comprehensive approach or view, or at least dimensioning more issues into the project that we thought to put together. And there were 2. One was the Concorso Universitario, which is the university-based Premio Piranesi that we always do, and the other was for professionals. The sites chosen were the Via dei Fori Imperiali, which since 1934, there has been virtually no work, no competition done on the Via dei Fori Imperiali. A few professors and a few architects have engaged specific sites during all of this time since World War II, but very few have been engaged by the comune, by the municipality, or by the national government, again, because this particular area, as you can see, between, we're talking about the area between the Colosseum, can I get to it? No. It's not. Okay, anyway, between the Colosseum and down here, between this and this area down here, I'll show you some more slides where some of this will become clear. This is a very bad rendition of the Lanciani map, which was produced in the early part of the 20th century, 1901, I think it was produced, where contemporary Rome and whatever was known then about the archaeology were drawn on exactly the same map. And it has become a reference for the coexistence in Rome of these multiple layers of history. And it was used as a reference point for the departure of this project. The area includes, in addition to the Colosseum and the Victor Emmanuel Monument, also the various fora, the Forum of Trajan, the Forum of Augustus, Forum of Nerva or Transitorio, the Forum Pacis, and also the Foro di Cesare and the Foro Romano on the other side. All of this area, as you can see from the yellow, was actually underground, and until 1934, actually until about 1929 is when they started doing some minor demolition, was part of a, I would say, medieval to Renaissance neighborhood called the Quartiere Alessandrino, having gotten its name from this Via Alessandrina, which sort of cuts right through the center of it. And that was completely demolished. All of the buildings there were taken away during the 1930s in order to make this new road that we're going to see in just a minute. This is what the fora, this is what the fora looked like in ancient Rome over here, or at least what we can surmise of the various fora. And this is what had happened by the early part of the Renaissance, and after which a number of building forms then were created on this space that were deemed to be less than significant. Here arises a very interesting problem. Who and how are the decisions made to, in a case like Rome, where multiple layers of urbanity exist, who and how are the decisions made to excavate, to show, to put on display one moment in the history of the city as opposed to another? This is a social as well as political, but also extremely culturally significant question. And in the case of Rome, here we have a document from 1911, roughly, and the Liberazione dei Fori is a very interesting title. The liberation of the Roman Fora is what this Corrado Ricci is advocating. He's suggesting in 1911 that all of the buildings that exist on top of the Roman Fora, because of the significance of ancient Rome and that set of traces for the city of Rome, that all of the rest that was constructed on top of it should be removed. And this is already 1911. By 1930, the project takes full swing and is mostly done. This is the sort of area that we're talking about. Here's the Colosseum, the Victor Emmanuel Monument. All of this area here is the Quartiere Alessandrino that exists on top of the various fora that I pointed out earlier. I won't get into all the sort of political, social upheaval that happened in order to eradicate the neighborhood, essentially erasing that part of Roman history. But all of these houses were destroyed, and all that you see here, other than what's below, was basically demolished. In 1885, Sacconi designs this Victor Emmanuel Monument, and it's a pity that it was never completed as he suggested, because it would have been, I think, slightly different as sort of a character in the protagonist character in the urban condition of Rome. Unfortunately, portions of this, especially the urban portions, were never constructed according to design, and what we're left with is the building form without some of the, let's say, landscape elements that were integral to it. And the design for the new Via dei Fori, Via dell'Impero, as it was called back then, is this line that you see here that literally connects the Colosseum to the Piazza Venezia, which is the large open space in front of the Victor Emmanuel monument. That all happened in this period between the late 20s and the mid-1930s. Retaining walls were constructed, and by 1950 we had a situation like this where the Trajan's Forum had been completely liberated from, whoops, going the wrong way, sorry about this. From this to this, essentially, with the excavation of the Esedra, and then eventually more of, I'm having trouble with this guy, eventually more of this area would be excavated as well. This is a part of the Trajan's Forum, the other half of it out here. This is a retaining wall constructed in the 1930s by an archaeologist architect by the name of Munoz, and it's all that is left of the main artery going through the the Quartiere Alessandrino, which is called Via Alessandrina. That's an important document urbanistically because it was the element that remained at the end of the sventramento, of the demolitions. And because it remained, it lasted up until just a few months ago, as a matter of fact. And recently they started demolition of that as well. And the Via Alessandrina will be completely gone in a few months yet. One other item I want to point out, this area here next to, this is the Basilica of Maxentius, and part of the necessity to make the Via dei Fori was to remove a piece of landscape, an actual hill that had been there. It's called the Velia, and the hill was summarily removed from here. All right. The hill is right in this area here. That's why all of this is not built up with plats as this is. These are all houses over here in the Quartiere Alessandrino. This is a hill that had a retaining wall keeping it from pushing on to the Basilica Maxentius. That hill, it was a rather substantial piece of landscape work to remove, but it was removed summarily, and so we now have an exposed exterior to the Basilica Maxentius that did not exist in ancient Roman times. This was the, let's say, contour of the land even as far back as ancient Rome. In fact, one of the few places that they were suggesting to put some mechanical systems for the new subway system was under the former Velia because they know there's no archaeology there. It's kind of an interesting situation that now the technology of this new subway will go under what was a landscape that was removed in the 1930s. Anyway, this was part of a rather substantial demolition project, and then eventually the roadway is constructed, and it looks like this down here, which is what we have today. All right, since 1934, when there were a number of projects suggested, there was a competition suggesting projects for the Littorio, which is a building form right in this area here, part of the removal of the Velia Hill that I was just referring to. Besides that competition in 1934, nothing has happened to Via dei Fori Imperiali, if not for the additional excavation of this parterre right here for the archaeological extension of the Forum of Trajan. So that's the situation that we found ourselves with. This is the retaining wall that Munoz built, holding back the Velia that was cut back, and this is the site of one of the interventions that we are proposing as well. And so the Via dei Fori Imperiali from the Colosseum is this image, and this is the rather substantial parade route. It's very wide and is used on important days. These are images from the 1934 competition, which saw some of the sort of more important architects from Terragni, Libera, participating. Ridolfi did a project. All of these were the main rationalist architects of the early 30s who were competing for this particular site right on the left there. None of those projects were built. The retaining wall by Munoz stayed. And so now we have a situation where we have a very large avenue that has most recently been closed to traffic. We did the competition to sort of redefine and reimagine this very substantial image of Rome that exists beyond the borders of Rome. In fact, we wanted to assure our participants that what we were doing was actually creating a set of images that would sort of be exported elsewhere as part of this particular imaginary of Rome, which is different from what is seen. As you can see here, this is the current state, and Via Alessandrina remains, or at least a portion of it does, but the parterre is gone, and all of this is archaeological down about 8 meters from the level of the city. So our project basically involves this area in between the two monuments, and the conditions of participation were essentially this biconsular, we called it, organization of each participant design group. One had to be a professor or researcher associated with one of the universities, and the other a professional design studio. We also accommodated for multidisciplinary groups that could be formed with people other than design professionals. The project areas, including the entire Via dei Fori Imperiali, all of the avenue was to be reconsidered as a possible redesign, and the new musealization of the fori themselves, the various fora. We also had a new antiquarium that was sited in one of the 3 sites, which I'll point out in a minute. And then optionally, we had this Auditorium of Hadrian, which was recently excavated right in Piazza Venezia and needed a resolution, and the Temple of Venere and Roma, which is right by the Colosseum. Those were optional. The first 3 are required in the competition. This is the project site. I'll go through this very quickly. The first one is the Auditorium of Hadrian, just recently found through part of the excavations for the new subway. We went on to Piazza Venezia, and basically this area, which is now just covered with temporary structures, needs to be made accessible. The Forum of Trajan, Forum of Caesar, Vespasian, all of them along this row right here had to be reconsidered. And that's what they look like now. And that was the historical photograph. This is the most recent excavation of that area. And then the new entrance to the archaeological area. Right now, there's a ticket booth at the end of Via Cavour. Our proposal is to use the Basilica Maxentius as the new entrance area for the area of the Via Sacra from the Arch of Titus down to the Arch of Septimus Severus. That area was considered as a separate item for the purposes of our competition and would require a separate entrance. This is the remains of the basilica. And then on the side of the retaining wall for the Velia, we suggested a new antiquarium for the Forma Urbis. For those of you who don't know, there is a marmoreal map of Rome that was constructed by Severo, was commissioned by Severo, the emperor, in the 3rd century AD, and it exists in fragments. And finding a home for it was part of the project brief here, creating a building for it. This is the site of the retaining wall of the Velia. This was the one done in the 1930s, and our project would be right on top of that. And then at the Colosseum, there is the Ludus Magnus. Sorry about that. Where are we? Okay. This is the Colle Oppio, another possible site for the antiquarium. And then there's one more, which is this Ludus Magnus, which was essentially a staging area and practice field for the combatants, for the gladiators This place has a direct link underground now to the Colosseum. In fact, this opening here connects directly to the center of the Ludus Magnus. All right, project brief went out, participants elected. It was a two-phase competition. The first phase was due in June, the second in July of last year. And at the end, with a substantial number of jury members, I think there were 22 at the last sitting, the jury decided to award ex aequo to 3 projects equal footing in terms of the winning. And they were the 3 that were represented by the University of Roma Tre. It's a Rome university. Luigi Franciosini is the professor, and Riccardo Petracchi is the professional. The second was La Sapienza, University La Sapienza, which is the other architecture school in Rome. Franco Purini is in charge of that, with Studio Valle, Tommaso Valle is the professional. And the third ex aequo was the University of Stuttgart with Alexander Schwarz, and the David Chipperfield office out of Berlin were the winners. We're going to go through these very quickly. I just want to highlight that each of these is quite different one from the other. There are 3 projects. I would sort of point out a few, let's say, scale-related items that are part of the first. The first project, Franciosini's work, is, I would perhaps put it in the category of an urban scaled intervention, where the city activity and the life of the city and the movement patterns of the city are what governs the positioning of the new interventions. The second one with Franco Purini was more tied to an architectural scale, where architectural artifacts are constructed and positioned in such a way as to redefine the use. The street itself in the second project is designed as a very unique architectural feature that essentially bridges across all the archaeological site. And the third one, the University of Stuttgart with Alexander Schwarz, is much more landscape related. So in the context of the 3 scales, I'll go forward and show you what some of these projects look like. This first one, the Roma Tre project, is tied to a representation, a redefining of some of the layers that were removed when the Alessandrina neighborhood was removed. In fact, one of the assets of this project, and what the committee sought to award the recognition for, was the fact that this project did less to define a public street in the linear fashion that it was defined earlier. That is, it's not a straight line from Piazza Venezia all the way to the Colosseum, but uses the geometry of the city that was in between the ancient Roman city and the contemporary city. And by using those lines and by connecting streets that are left only partially available on either side, you see how this particular intervention, which are a series of platforms that ride above the archaeological level. In some cases, the archaeological level is as, let's say, as far away as 11 to 15 meters from the current city datum. In this case, these side streets are extended through the archaeological site, which is something that currently is not available. In fact, one of the problems of Roman archaeology, and I suspect archaeology in many instances, is that it becomes a destination only. That is, I have to buy a ticket, enter through a gate, enter a compound that is circumscribed, called archaeological park or archaeological site, and it becomes a place for people going to see archaeology. In this case, the archaeology is down at the lower level and still requires admission, but up above we have a city that sort of transverses. It traverses and moves through the archaeology in a way similar to how the archaeological experience, or the, let's say, urban experience of the archaeological moment might have been. To our mind's eye, this is a very successful representation in the medium of architecture of an architectural archaeological symbiosis. In this case, the city itself can actually move through the archaeology. Someone going to work from one side to the other would move through the archaeological site on a daily basis and make it part of his patterning of urban situation. The project is very complex. I'm sorry the projector is not doing as good a job of showing some of the detail of this, but it's a very well thought out project. All of the pathways that you see in places like this correspond to already existing documented pathways that existed before. And in essence, one of the reasons that we found this project to be particularly in sync with our sort of project goals was that it managed to give us a physical presence of many of those layers that were lost in the demolition process of the 1930s, while keeping obviously a separation and an identifiability to the archaeology as separate from the contemporary city, which are obviously on two different strata of urban life. But the architectural solution, a kind of sectional solution where you take and you soften the blow between the sort of 15-meter difference between some of these sites vis-a-vis the contemporary city, is what was particularly well done here. Besides the fact that some of these drawings are quite elegant to look at. I'm sorry, again, the reproduction is not as detailed as it could be. We have a catalog now with all of these drawings reproduced in it from all of the projects, not just the winning projects. So if anyone's interested, I'm happy to share one with you. The second project is the one that's a bit more architectural in character. Franco Purini's work and his hand is evident in many of these drawings. His intention was to create a new Via dei Fori Imperiali, a veritable bridge across the archaeology, so that one can identify this bridge as a overlaid new artifact on top of, and sort of aligning the old archaeology with the contemporary needs of the city by allowing some movement through. This would all be pedestrian with the exception of emergency vehicles. There would be a tram system as well as an open area in the center for emergency vehicles to go through. The idea of a thoroughfare, part of the original plan of Via dei Fori Imperiali was that it would be connected to Via Ostiense and go all the way out to Ostia, the port facility of Rome. That never quite materialized, and when they recently made it a pedestrian system only, it has wreaked some sort of traffic havoc with the city of Rome, and they're still suffering. Anyway, in this case, what we have is essentially a new bridge that is above and identifiably separate from the archaeological area. None of the medieval or Renaissance layers are represented here, with a few minor exceptions where Via Alessandrina, for instance, was kept in this project as well. These are the designs of the actual bridge mechanism. There is an attempt to keep minimal the intrusion onto the archaeological sites below, and the idea is simply to have this as a kind of urban necessity above the archaeological layer, which governs essentially the form and the space of this part of the city at this point. Again, I apologize for this is actually a very detailed drawing, but a little difficult to see. The antiquarium was located in the area where we were pointing out before, where the Veglia was. This is the place for the Marmoria map, the marble map of Rome. It's also a museum, obviously, and again, these drawings and now the 3D reproductions are indicating the architectural nature and quality of this interior space. The third project, and here we're going to sort of something completely different, done by the group from Stuttgart and Berlin. Alexander Schwartz, who's the design director for the Chipperfield office in Berlin, was the sort of head presenter here. And what Alexander alludes to in this very, let's say, emblematic drawing of his project is a sort of 18th century notion of the voyage en Italie, the visiting Italy in order to see the ruins, in order to sort of walk through the landscape to see what was left of ancient Rome. And many of the things that Vasily was talking about earlier are being evoked here, from the picturesque to the sublime, even with images like this. And but technically, behind this project is also an understanding of a very real fact, and that's that of all the European capitals, Rome has some of the least amount of green space within its urban boundaries, within the city, of any of the European capitals, in fact, of many cities in the world. And to sort of bring back some of the greenery that Sasha seems to think is necessary in Rome, he's turned the project into a landscape project. And for those of you who are archaeologists, I'm going to say something very sacrilegious. What this project suggests is actually covering some already excavated and already exposed archaeology in order to create a series of images. These are all the interventions that the project is broken down into. Each one has a separate plan, section, and construction suggestion. I will do this very quickly. I'm almost done. Sorry about that. There we go. Before and after. As you can see, this is a rather radical approach to sort of proposing a way of negotiating the contemporary city and the archaeological remains. One very positive feature, I think, is that there are no borders, no boundaries. One walks from one level to the other without making any fences or gates or transitions of that type. This is a before and after as well. Before and where are you? After. Two projects, very important. One is the new entrance to the Fori here, with new buildings adjacent and actually inserted into the narthex of the Basilica Maxentius, and then another new building here, which is the Antiquarium. I'll show you some images of that in just a second. Come on, let's go. Sorry about that. There we go, before. And that's the, oh, come on. This is the entrance to the Forum and the Antiquarium. The area adjacent to the Colosseum. And then the Forma Urbis Marmoria gets a new building at the Ludus Magnus. And with that, I'm going to stop right here. Thank you very much.